I don't know if you've heard this story of a woman who was sitting in a plane next to a gentleman, and she was a very attractive woman. I read this in an airline magazine. And he looked at her and kept looking at her and finally propositioned her for $1 million. He said, one night, 1 million. She just looked at him and wondered, is this guy up to some mischief or what? And she started looking in different directions, but about halfway on the flight, she said, are you serious, 1 million? And he said, yeah. She said, okay, just tell me when and where. And so they shook hands and agreed. About 10 minutes before landing, he looked at her and said, I have to tell you the truth. I don't have $1 million. Would you settle for $10? And she looked at him and said, what do you think I am? To which he said, we have already established that. We are now haggling over the price. Interesting. Interesting. But the more I thought of it, I asked myself the question, is that what it's all about? We all have a price? That at a certain point, if the price is right, we will lose our absolutes? That there will no longer be a point of reference for right and wrong except that the price is right? I can guarantee you, in this entire audience, it is distinctly possible that there are some things you will never do no matter what the price. Will never cross some lines no matter what the price, which tells me every one of us, for whatever reason, we have some things that are non-negotiable. For example, I think an average person sitting here, there would be no price suitable to compromise the safety and the sanctity of your children. No price, doesn't matter what it is. You will even surrender your life in order to protect their safety and their sanctity. Where do we go for absolutes? How do we find them in the shifting sands of pluralism and postmodernism? Have you ever sat in your car and you're driving and you come to a traffic light and the light is red and you stop? You look at the other lane and you are not sure whether you're moving or the guy in the other lane is moving. But you think one of the two of you is moving, but the light is still red. What do you instinctively do in order to make sure you're not moving? You go for the brake. After you put your foot to the brake, if you're still not sure whether you're moving or he's moving, what do you do next? You look out of your window and you look at something that is immovable, a lamppost or a tree or a building, and you start measuring yourself by that immovable object. What do you think would happen if the tree started moving too? Or the building started moving? Ladies and gentlemen, that, I'm afraid, is the time in which we live. Nothing is stationary. There's no point of reference left anymore. And if you ask an average university student in the West, what is the basis of your absolutes? I can honestly say to you, chances are he or she will be stunned that you actually believe there is such a thing as an absolute. There's a story told of a man in Leicestershire, England, who used to go to work every morning and he would stop outside a clockmaker's store and he would take his watch and synchronize it with the clock outside. And he used to be working at the factory nearby. But he'd stop and adjust his watch with the clock. And one day the clockmaker came out and said, excuse me, I have a question for you. You do this every day. You stop outside my clock store. You look at one of my clocks outside. You measure, you adjust your time with my clock. What kind of work do you do? He said, I'm embarrassed to tell you this. I'm the timekeeper at the local factory, and I have to ring the bell at 4 o'clock every afternoon, and my watch doesn't work very well. The clockmaker said, I hate to tell you this, but my clock doesn't work very well either. I adjust it from the bell that I hear from the factory at 4 o'clock every afternoon. And so we have the challenge of self-referencing, the challenge of no absolute, which way to actually look at, and the constantly moving markers and the lines and the units from which we measure ourselves. How do we find absolutes in this? Now, ladies and gentlemen, my major work is in really philosophy, and it'd be very easy for me to put you to sleep tonight by taking a philosophical approach of absolutes and how we do it, and I've written books on the subject and dealt with it. But at a dinner engagement, rather than go that route, let me go a much simpler route. You don't have to agree with all of my assumptions, but I just want you to think through this, because there is a passage in the Bible where we see a challenge given to Jesus Christ in this issue of absolutes. He is extraordinarily positioned in the desert. He's hungry. And he's been there alone, and the body is beginning to get weak. And the enemy of our souls, Satan, comes and tests him. We often call it the temptation. I prefer to call it the testing. It's the testing. And I want you to notice how the testings come, because it is no different ultimately in the way you and I are appealed to in these issues of absolutes. But I want you to notice how he responds in every instance, and he will demonstrate for you that a text without a context can become a pretext. A text without a context can become a pretext. And Satan is very clever. He uses a text with which to cause Jesus to stumble or make the wrong decision. And in every instance that he tempts him or tests him, what T.S. Eliot said is right. These temptations are the greatest treason to do the right thing for the wrong reason. These temptations are the greatest treason to do the right thing for the wrong reason. So your temptation and mine might come in a slightly different context, but at the core of it, it will be the same, to compromise what we know and believe to be true. So the first thing that Satan does is make a false assumption, and so he comes to a false conclusion. Here's what he says. Why don't you turn these stones into bread? Because if you turn these stones into bread, you will have the whole world following you. So go ahead and do it. Turn these stones into bread. And when you turn these stones into bread, the whole world will follow you. And Jesus looks at him and he says, "Begone. It is written that man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." It's a brilliant response, because he points the tempter to the word, which is an absolute, and he says to him, the answer is really not the absence of a miracle. The answer lies in a predicament that is true globally, and the answer is that our problem is not material. Our problem is actually spiritual. What do I mean by that? D.L. Moody once said, if a man is stealing nuts and bolts from a railway track and you want to change him, so you send him to university to educate him, at the end of his education, he will steal the whole railway track. In the year 2010, the British Broadcasting Corporation did a survey that it does every year, and for the first time, it came out with a different conclusion. Every year, they do a survey on what is it that humanity fears the most. Every year, number one has been poverty, number two has been the environment. Poverty and environment, the thing they think are the greatest challenge facing humanity. In the year 2010, in December, the British Broadcasting Corporation released its study. Do you know number one and number two became number two and number three? Do you know what became the number one problem that people think is the greatest calamity and problem facing humanity? Corruption. Corruption of the human heart. Take a nation like India, with all of its brilliance and all of its intellectual prowess and all of its accomplishments, and you talk to an average human being on the streets of Delhi or in any village, and they will tell you what troubles them most is not that India doesn't have the intellectual resources, but they wonder whether it has the character and the incorruptibility of power. The incorruptibility of power. When you say that the problem is bread, I find it fascinating that I live in a country called the United States, which has had an extraordinary history of prosperity. Or you look at England, tremendous at one time in the great British Empire. Where do you think the stridency of atheism is coming from these days? It's coming from the bastions of Oxford, like Richard Dawkins, or Sam Harris at Stanford University. All these years of prosperity, all these years of blessing, all these years of success, all these years of abundance, plenty of bread. Who are they following now? If bread is the problem, then it ought to be a nation that is naturally given to a greater devotion of heart to things sacred. But it is not so. And you go to many parts of the world where there's deprivation, where there's want, and where there's hunger, and where there's lack, and you'll find the average person hungering for God. I was telling an audience, whether it was last night or night before I forget, Delhi was my hometown for the first 20 years of my life. And I was walking past the famed Regal Cinema in Connaught Place, because I grew up there in Delhi, so every time I go back to my old haunts. And a man with one leg gone and half a leg, bandaged up with all kinds of ugly stains on it, and his iron hands pretty gnarled, lay flat on a little piece of contraption that obviously somebody had made for him with 4 wheels, and he was just pushing himself, lying facing the sky. No sideward look, hardly, but just pushing away. And I saw him in my bag, hands full of bags that I'd just finished some shopping. And my heart just sank as I saw him wheel by, and I was on the verge of just stopping him, but there were a lot of people, and I didn't want to draw attention. So I just walked steadily as much as I could beside him till there wasn't that much of a crowd. And I stopped him. I speak enough Hindi. I just stopped him for a moment, and then I got on my haunches, and I took a 100-rupee note, which is not much for me or for you. It equivalent to about $2. For him, it would have been an awful lot of money. And I opened his palm and squeezed that 100-rupee note into his hand. And he just could look at that. He knew what it was. And he looked at me. At one stage, he said, Khuda. At another stage, he said, Bhagwan. He said, Bhagwan aapko, Sabji, he said, respected sir. Sabji, respected sir. Bhagwan aapko bhala kare. May God richly bless you. A man without a leg. How much bread does he have on his table at night? You see, the predicament of the human heart is not the absence of bread, but it is the presence of this thing we call ourself. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. One of my great heroes as I was a young student of philosophy and theology was the great English journalist Malcolm Muggeridge. I think he was the greatest British journalist of the 20th century. Absolutely brilliant with language. It was, the year was 1990 when I happened to be speaking in Sussex, and somebody told me Muggeridge lived about 5 miles up the road. I said it would be a dream come true if I could just spend half an hour with Malcolm Muggeridge. This fellow says, I know Malcolm, I'll arrange it for you. Next day I found myself at a table having lunch with Malcolm and Kitty Muggeridge, one of the greatest journalists ever. He lived a promiscuous life. He lived a slanderous life. And one time editor of Punch magazine, a correspondent with The Guardian, and very, very noted journalist, a household name in England in the 20th century. And as we were having lunch, he signed 1 or 2 of his books for me. And in one of his books called The Green Stick, A Chronicle of Wasted Years, he tells his own pilgrimage to Christ, how he lived a profligate lifestyle and so on. At one point he tells this story. He said, I used to teach journalism in the south of India. I loved India, he said. The Indian higher people like Nehru and all knew him well. And he said, I was teaching journalism in the south, and I loved India, and early in the morning I used to come into the river to have my bath. And then I got into the river, and as I was swimming, way out in a distance, I saw a woman quietly disrobe and get into the water herself. It's quite far away, he said, but I could figure out by the contours of her body it wasn't a man. He said, I decided I was going to swim in her direction and somehow seduce her. So he swam and swam. He said, something in my heart said, don't. But he said, I kept moving in that direction, and as he swam and swam and swam towards her, suddenly he emerged face to face with her, and he shook the water off his face. And Muggeridge, in his book, The Green Stick, A Chronicle of Wasted Years, says this: I was stunned and horrified when I realized I was eyeball to eyeball with a woman with leprosy. She was a leper. He said, I thought I would be sick to my stomach, and I was on the verge of saying something. What a lecherous face, when he realized the problem was not her. He said, I realized the problem was my lecherous heart. The problem was my lecherous heart. You can never find an absolute just by turning to your own heart. Because your heart and my heart can rationalize away, we can reason away, we can talk ourselves into things that we know are wrong, and we can argue ourselves in drawing line after line after line. And the Bible reminds you and me clearly, what Jesus says to the tempter is, Begone, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. In other words, there's a law of God, there's a moral standard that's given for you and for me. The second temptation comes. The second temptation is rather very clever. He says, it is written in the word that he will give angels charge over you so that you will not dash your foot against a stone. The devil is quoting Scripture. He's quoting Scripture to Jesus, taking a text. And he says, it says that you'll never dash your foot against a stone. So I've got a challenge for you. Why don't you jump and put the word to test? Jesus looked at him and said, Begone, it is also written that you shall not test and you shall not tempt the Lord your God. Every text has to be put into a context, lest it become a pretext. He said, I'm not here to try and test God and my Father and see whether He is going to honor His word. I'm here to tell you I have absolute trust in Him. What is it that Satan is really appealing to? Satan is appealing to his pride. Why don't you do it? You call the shots. You decide. You play God. You become the God of God. Isn't that what we see today? Humanity becoming the God of God. As Alexander Pope said, you have snatched from his hand the balance and the rod. You have rejudged his justice. You have become the God of God. C.S. Lewis, writing in one of his books, says, there is one vice of which no man in the world is free, which everyone else loathes when he sees it in someone else. Did you hear that? No person is free from this, but we loathe it when we see it in someone else, and of which hardly any people except Christians ever imagine that they are guilty themselves. There is no fault which makes a man more unpopular, and no fault which we are more unconscious of in ourselves. And the more we have it ourselves, the more we dislike it in others. The fact of the matter is, the whole world is plagued with this problem. No matter what we name ourselves, we actually end up battling pride every day. Every one of us. We battle pride every day. This struggle of power, absolute power. Let me give you a little illustration of this. There was a big burly black man who got into a bus in the early days of his youth, solidly built. And a little boy sitting next to him in the bus didn't want him sitting next to him. So he just shoved this man, and the man moved. And the little boy shoved again. The man moved. He did this 3 or 4 times, and the big, burly, muscle-bound guy kept moving. But he just eyed this young boy and really wanted to let him have it, but he didn't. Finally, the bus stop came, and the big, muscle-bound black gentleman got up and was about to get off, but before he did, he put his hand into his pocket and lifted his business card and gave it to the little boy. It just said this, Joe Louis, world heavyweight boxing champion. You know what? Joe Louis, they said, had the strength in his fist to be able to hit through the side of a bull. And this little pipsqueak of a guy was shoving him around. He could have made mincemeat out of him. Who do you think had greater power? The little boy who was shoving him around, or the bigger man who was able to take it? Is able to take it. The thing that we so often get seduced by is this thing we call power and we call pride. And so we try to command God and make him do our bidding. And make him do our bidding. I want to give you a little illustration, and please bear with me as I give this because I think it is important. And you may not agree with the application of it, but I think you'll appreciate the illustration of it. This year in September, it'll be my privilege to address the United Nations Prayer Breakfast for the third time. It's a real honor. It's the opening day of the UN General Assembly. It's been my honor to do it twice over some years, and this last year when they wrote to me to come and do it again this year, I was deeply honored. I have to respect every worldview in front of me there. But last time I spoke there, they gave me a very tough subject. It's a navigating with absolutes in a relativistic world, and I took a completely different approach to it. And they were all seated there at 6:30 in the morning. And I said to them, I want you to think of yourself in these terms. You struggle with absolutes, and I struggle with absolutes. I said there are 4 areas in which we struggle for definition. Area number 1, evil. How do you define evil? How do you define it? And I went into various descriptions of it, and they were listening very carefully. I said there's a second area in which we struggle for definition. Justice. How do we define justice? I said, you all talk about just societies. You talk about looking for justice in this world. I said, how do we define justice? And they're nodding their heads. I said, then there's a third area in which we struggle, and that is love. I said, you're here by great appointment, tremendous appointment. Your governments trust you. They've sent you here as ambassadors. You miss your families. And you're sitting here today wondering how long you'll be away from your spouse or your children, whatever. You're missing them because of this thing called love. They were nodding their heads. I said, evil, justice, love. I said, and then there's one more area in which you struggle for an absolute, and that is forgiveness. I said, some of you are going to blow it big time and blow the ethics, and then you're going to come to your colleagues and ask them to forgive you. What is the basis on which they will forgive you? What is the absolute? I said, the 4 areas you're looking for absolute: evil, justice, love, and forgiveness. By this point, they're leaning forward and listening to me. I said, we may come out with different answers, but here is my proposition to you. There is one place in the world where these 4 converged on a hill called Calvary. At the cross. When Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. Now, I want to have you pause for just a moment. Because in the story of the temptation, it says that Satan left him after these temptations and went away for a while, and he said he would be back again. Do you know when he came back? When Jesus was on the cross, and he said to him, if you are the Christ, why don't you save yourself and save us too? You know, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to think about this very deeply. We're in a world where we're hurting each other. We've not learned how to disagree without being disagreeable. We're really hurting each other. Thomas Merton said, we are not at peace with our fellow man because we are not at peace with ourselves, and we are not at peace with ourselves because we are not at peace with God. How are we ever going to build peace for the future if we are not willing to forgive one another? The logic of unforgiveness says this: if you hurt me, my son will come and hurt you. That's the logic of unforgiveness. And so it goes on and on and on. You hurt me, my son comes and hurts you. Your grandson comes and hurts my son. And this cycle goes on and on and on and on in the logic of unforgiveness. When you stand in front of Calvary, Jesus says, Father, forgive them. Forgive them. Unless we learn to forgive one another and know what evil is and what justice is and what love is, we will never live in a world of peace for our children. You know, love and forgiveness in the heart of a child secures peace for the next generation. Did you hear me? Love and forgiveness in the heart of a child secures peace for next generation.
You've been watching Let My People Think with Dr. Ravi Zacharias. We're grateful for your prayers and financial support. If you'd like to know more about this ministry or would like to donate to our efforts, you can call us at 1-800-448-6766 or visit us online at www.rzim.org. You can also stay connected to RZIM through Twitter and Facebook. Our mailing address is RZIM, Post Office Box 921939, Norcross, Georgia 30010.
You know, friends, recently I was in Manila in the Philippines, speaking at a discipleship conference where there were 8,000 delegates who were attending. And some business people asked me if I would do a dinner as well. To be honest with you, I thought it was just to go out for dinner. And I showed up there and they took me there, only to find out there were 50 to 60 business people who were sitting around tables and they wanted me to deliver a talk on life's purpose and meaning and making your life significant. During the Q&A time, a tall, good-looking gentleman stands up and he says, I'm going to be transparent. I never even expected to be here, but after hearing what you had to say, I want to talk about myself. He said, my life has fallen apart. Everything has collapsed. Even toyed with the idea of ending my own life, he said. Find out he's a film actor, a prominent man in the country, well-known, but privately duplicitous in his own words, and things had fallen apart. What a privilege it was to talk to him, to pray with him, to share the purpose of life that Jesus Christ gives to us. All of this happens because people pray for us, people stand with us, people support us. We intend to keep doing this and ask you to remain faithful in your part. Many young lives like this and older lives are challenged and turned around by the grace of God and the power of His Holy Spirit's work in their lives with appointments that He creates for us that we ourselves did not envision. May God bless you. Pray for this gentleman whose life has been transformed, but who still has a long way to go. We will be there for him and with him. We ask that you will do the same with us. May God bless you.
Next time on Let My People
Groups of them or tea or coffee with them. And by the time each one of them finished telling me their story, it was so much to take in, overwhelming, incredible transformation of lives, people going out to ministry under OCCA's banner. One of them is a young gal from New York. I don't know the exact details, but somehow through an illicit relationship between an imam and her mother in New York, she was conceived and born. Now her story is absolutely breathtaking, and she is preparing to become one of the fellows of RZIM to be stationed in New England, coming up shortly, our graduate from the one-year program in the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. The evidence. I have a letter with me that I carry because it's so special. In fact, this week I heard from him. He's just aced all of his courses, and his father wants to come and meet with me in Atlanta coming up in August. And this guy wrote to me last year around this time when I was in Bahrain. Listen to this letter. Dear sir, this is Abraham from Bahrain. We just met last night. I honestly want to tell you that your speech was absolutely awesome. I have been an admirer of your ministry since the time I first heard you speak in Bahrain in 2003. I was only 5 years old then. But now I am 14, and I have finished reading all of your books. The Real Face of Atheism, The Lotus and the Cross, Jesus Among Other Gods, Sense and Sensuality, The End of Reason, Why I'm Not an Atheist, The Grand Weaver, Walking from East to West, etc. They have made a great impact on my life and my way of thinking. I really wanted to get your email ID, and I wrote to the office requesting for it, but I've not received a reply from them for more than a year. Must have gone to Washington by mistake. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for giving me your ID yesterday. I've also heard many of your tapes, like Barriers to Belief, Absolute Truth in Relative Terms, A Fish Out of Water, The Life That Lost Its Focus, What Happened After God's Funeral, which is my personal favorite, The Haunting Spectre of Guilt, Though the Fig Tree Does Not Bud, The Lostness of Man, Who Are You, God? You know, sir, you may feel all this is pretty hard for a 14-year-old to digest, but honestly, I love those messages. I saw the DVD of you speaking at the University of Michigan in the Q&A session. Thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful impact you've made on my life. I will always remember to pray for you in your ministry. May God bless you abundantly and give you a long, long life. I remain yours faithfully, Abraham Matthew, Bahrain. When Matt and I were boarding the plane in Atlanta for this flight, a young man with a backpack on his shoulder was way ahead of us in the line. He stepped out of line and came back. And he looked at me, he said, "Are you Ravi Zacharias?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I don't believe this." He gave up his line way ahead, and he went with us. We could tell he was hurting. Matt made the comment. He had just come from a funeral of a friend. And he said, "You know, I can't thank you enough for what your radio program and your books and all of that mean to me." He said, "I just heard your voice and recognized your voice." The evidence of God's moving will always reaffirm for you His calling. I don't know where He's called you, where He positions you, and you know full well when this evidence comes that it has very little to do with you. It has everything to do with God's great design, grand weaver, and His great call, and at the right time and place that happens. I hear you've had a great day today, and the Lord really moved as Lyle had spoken spiritual formation and all of that. And, you know, when I hear things like that, I say, that's what it's all about. That's what it's all about. God meeting you where you are in the deepest struggles of your soul to help you make that turn and move on for greater glory, greater triumphs, greater victories. That evidence will always be there. The incidents, the accidents, the evidence. The fourth thing I want to talk to you is about the distance. The distance that God has allotted for you and for me, we do not know, but we do know it comes to an end. We do not know how far He is going to take you. We do not know when that moment comes where He tells you, it's time for you to step back and let someone else take this baton and run. And after doing this for 40-some years now, for the last 10 years of my life, this has been a primary focus for me. Who will carry this baton? How do we find succession? RZIM never has been and never will be about one person. It had dared to be about one person. And I just bring before you this reality that there is a distance for each one of us, and someday that distance will come to an end. And there comes a time in every human being's life when the convictions carried in your heart have to be transferred to a younger mind. There comes a time in every human being's life where the convictions you've carried in your heart have to be transferred to a younger mind. What I want to say to you is this distance running is the distance being run by a team, not by an individual. That's the vision for RZIM. If you have not heard some of the rest of the members of this team, I could name them one after another. When I sit back and hear them speak, I feel a deep sense of fulfillment that I know this has come together because of the grace of God. There are some individuals, by the way, for whom the distance will be run, and they've run the race and they move on. God calls many to do that. They fulfill their mission and they're gone. I was not one of those. I always had this longing to work with a team so that we had accountability, we had fraternity, we had fellowship, we had the love and the camaraderie so that we could stand together on the platform and answer questions. And RZIM's vision has always been for that kind of a team. And so I move to my final thought. From the incidents, the accidents, the evidence, the distance, and the last thing I want to leave with you is the providence, how God is now opening doors for us. Just in this last trip, to begin in China, who would have ever dreamed 10 to 15 years ago that the fastest growing church in the world would be in China. Unbelievable. And here we were on a given night in Shanghai, in a beautiful, old, nearly 100-year-old church building. And the audience has packed it out waiting. There was no room. They were sitting on the floor. They were just packed to capacity. And the pastor came up to the room where I was preparing for my talk, and I had my team with me. Some of our team members, Ai Ching was there, Michelle Tepper was there, and naturally Matt was there, and so on. And I was alone in this room, and the pastor came, and I said, you know what? I stand in this upstairs room here, and I think to myself, what history this building has seen. He said, you know, Ravi, it is amazing that Mao Zedong did not destroy this building in the Cultural Revolution. Nobody can figure out why. In this prominent part of Shanghai, that this building was not gutted and destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. He said, you'll be walking past one room where a Chinese audience will be gathered, and they gather 3 times every Sunday here, fill it out every time. And he said, the pastor preaches the word, and every service there are conversions, every Sunday there are baptisms. He said, only 7 years ago, the pastor said, and he said, you know, I wish we didn't have to worry every Sunday where we are going to go to baptize our people. And an elderly woman came up to him, and she said, you know, Pastor, when I was a little girl, I used to go to this church. I know there's a baptistry in this church. I've witnessed baptisms in here. I don't remember where, but I know they were baptized right here. So they begin a search with engineers and tapping floors, tapping hither and yon. Sure enough, they find a baptistry in that church. And they're baptizing them every Sunday. One early morning, we were driven to a breakfast where I was to speak to about 50 or 60 business people. And as I spoke, they were in no hurry to leave. They wanted to talk, and the key Chinese businessman came to me and he said, Ravi, I'd pay for you to come here regularly. We'd gather business people like this. God is doing things in Shanghai here. I know this place must have a special purpose for you in mind. I said, why do you say that? He said, because I know you've been here before. I said, no, I haven't been here before. He said, no. Just around the corner is an apartment building where the Chinese evangelist Wang Mingdao used to live. And in 1989, you came to visit him along with a Billy Graham associate. I said, that is astounding. I didn't know it was in this corner of town. I said, you're right, I've been here. That evangelist Wang Mingdao, who'd been imprisoned for 18 years. First he was put into prison, and then he was released when he denied his Lord. But he walked the streets of his city saying, my name is Peter, I've denied my Lord. My name is Peter, I've denied my Lord. Mao Zedong had him arrested again, and for 18 years he served his time till he was finally released. The prayers of a Wang Mingdao, the prayers of people like that are being answered. What is happening in Asia Pacific is extraordinary. And so RZIM is going to launch full scale into Asia Pacific, presently in 5 countries, in China, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in Malaysia, and in Indonesia. And we're about to plant apologists in these places. Not only in Asia Pacific, but we are getting heavily involved in places of Islam and the dominant Islamic worldview. I don't know how many of you have met Mire, who's here from Syria. I've known her family, and her father is a pastor. I spent about 45 minutes with her this morning because of my great concern for the country, and her father had written to me about all that is going on there, and today she was telling me about her own friends that have been blown up by suicide bombers. You know, Syria is a beautiful country. It has the wall over which Paul was lowered, from which the world of evangelism began to the Gentile world. It must be precious in God's eyes. The street called straight still exists in Damascus. We have to understand Islam. We have to take on the challenge, and we will never win the Muslim by anger and hatred and vitriol. we can win them with a sound apologetic and an undying love, a love that reaches out and is willing to listen before we even speak. The world of Islam is in turmoil today. Just before coming here, watching the news, and Senem, my colleague, wrote to me yesterday, and I've sent it to the rest of the team. She says, I'm writing this letter to you with tears in my eyes. All that's happening in the Islamic world, we need to get to them. Thirdly, it's the young. The most amazing thing to me is how many in our audience are in their 20s. And I hear some of you here in this week are in your teens. Not for long. The years roll by faster than you can imagine. But this is your world. This is your world as a young man and as a young woman. Watch the streets of Istanbul today. Most of them demonstrating there are the young. They want answers. They want to interact. They want to listen. We are seeing the young in every audience. When I was with Vince Vitale not too long ago at Princeton, those of you who may have seen that in live streaming, packed to capacity, overflow crowd. Coming up, and so also in January in UCLA, I think there was somewhere between 2,000 to 3,000, every chair taken and overflow rooms involved. Every university setting to which we are going, I'm heading out, coming up in the fall to Dartmouth, and already we are just getting so inundated with the possibility of great outreach in those areas that we are deciding to reach out for the young very pointedly. In the last 3 days, I've been going back and forth, because I'm going to be in India in September and then fly straight in for Dartmouth. And I don't know how many of you know the name of the actor Stephen Baldwin, but he's just been in India and contacted me, and he said, Ravi, we could get together a whole host of young Bollywood actors and actresses. Will you team up with me and come there in September? We can have a mega event here to reach the acting community and the community of the arts. And just today I said, if it can't be done on this day and that, I don't know how I can stay on, because I don't want to arrive just a few hours before the Dartmouth event. I tell all of this to say to you, the young are searching, the young are hungry. I will close with an illustration to sustain that. And the last thing I want to say to you is that the vision of this ministry is ultimately to reach those who are asking genuine questions and to help the Christian think again, so that we are not living a shallow, insipid Christianity that has no effect on your private life, which the world very quickly diagnoses and sees and doesn't want to have anything to do with it. We must think in terms of the longest bridge that is needed in your life and mine, the bridge between here and here. The bridge between here and here. The head and the heart. Archbishop Donald Cogan said, it's the longest journey in life to find the bridge between the head and the heart. I challenge you as Christians to learn how that bridge is built by the Holy Spirit of God in your life, so that you're not just cerebrally driven with the answers, but devotionally embrace the implications of your message. It's critical we do that the implications of the message be embraced in your devotional life. The key to your ultimate success as an apologist is not in how well you answer these questions, but how deeply you are connected to your Savior. How deeply you're connected to your Savior. I started off with a person who wanted to go his own way, and who was willing to go his own way as long as God went his, and somebody else who went his own way and made it look like God's. Let me close with these two stories for you. I very seldom watch a movie on a plane, not because I'm against it for any reason, but normally when I get onto a plane, I really want to get some sleep. I want to get some time alone. I'm tired. I either just close my eyes, or I think, or I take out a sheet of paper and start doing some reflections on things. But some of these journeys do get long, you know, 12 and 15-hour flights. I don't know if God intended us to do that, but we do it anyway. And I was just flying back from, I think, from Singapore to Oxford. That's a 13-hour flight from Singapore to London. So I was telling Matt about this, and I noticed they were showing an Indian movie amongst others. I don't know how many of you have seen Indian movies. They're amazing. All the way from the West is catching up. Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, that's the kind of movies India used to produce. We just spend millions doing it. They've been doing it for a longer time. Or at least some of them are rightly named Mission Impossible. How they do the things on that moving train at 90 miles an hour. Tom Cruise evidently cruises and does all those things. So it's the incredible things that happen in Indian movies. I saw one Indian movie in which the Taj Mahal was being stolen every night. And so, you know, that kind of movie, you can just say, if I miss 15 minutes, I've missed absolutely nothing. And every movie, of course, has to have a fellow chasing a girl and around trees. And finally, when they catch up, the scene changes. As they say, one Indian comedian was asked, what's the difference in love on the Western screen and love on the Indian screen? He answered in one word, trees. That's what happens. So this movie had its version of trees in it. But the movie in Hindi is called Jab Tak Hai Jaan. Jab Tak Hai Jaan, which literally means till I have life. And it was an Indian actress who asked me to please see it sometime and critique it for them. And if I do the Bollywood thing, I want to critique that movie for them. It's a beautiful young girl who is engaged to be married to somebody, but she really doesn't want it. And there's a famous Indian actor by the name of Shah Rukh Khan, who's a waiter in a restaurant. Actually, before all of that, he was a bomb diffuser and then went into the restaurant industry and all that. And all this happens. So she meets up with him, and she doesn't want to go through this marriage. She wants this guy. So she goes to church. This is an Indian movie. She walks into a church, stands in front of the altar, and she's talking to the Lord on the crucifix, asking for him to please help her get this guy. It finally happens where she decides she will not go through with that. She'll wait for him. And she makes a vow to God. She says, I will not cross any lines if you will give him to me. But at her own instigation, the line was crossed. And she had told him this. One day she's driving with him, he drops her off, and he has a terrible accident, and he's close to death. And she prays, goes back to church and says, if you will save his life, I will let him go. The rest of the story is a life is saved. And he says to her, tell me something. My life is saved, but I can't have you. You want me to keep on living when my love for you is so deep and so strong? Fascinating conversation. Only the Indian philosophical mind could go through some of that. And at one point, when he goes back to his army responsibilities, diffusing bombs and so on, a man looks at him and he says, you know what? I worry about you. You go and diffuse these things and you don't wear any protective gear. Because he's come to a point where he doesn't care whether he lives or not. And he looks at his colleague and says, you know what? You face life every day with its threats. What armor do you wear for life? So the bomb will finish you off in a moment. Life stabs at you every day. What do you wear to protect yourself against life? It's a fascinating end to the whole movie. And the conclusion is incredible. How there's so much of biblical motif in this, produced by an Indian producer by the name of Yash Chopra, who died shortly after the film was released and won the award for the best film. He himself was struggling with cancer. And I say to you, this is the Hindu world. Shah Rukh Khan is a Muslim man,
and the whole movie is about a conversation with Jesus. You tell me they're not asking questions? Amazing. So this actress says, come here and discuss this movie with the acting world. They love their own stories to be evaluated. I say to you, the moment is ripe for you and me as apologists to answer questions for a world that is willing to listen to what Jesus has to say, to the deepest questions of their heart, because their gods are silent. There is no answer. We want to be sensitive to God. We want to be humble before Him. And we want to do the work while it is day. To bridge this to this and to reach people in their deepest struggles and their deepest pain. I'm going to close with about just a silent minute or two. And I want you to deal with God. What He's calling you to do as an apologist, where He wants you. I believe with all my heart that as we pray for each other, the vision that this ministry has to reach the thinker and to answer the questions of people, to find that bridge between the head and the heart, and to be close to where they are, not from a distance, to take the grand weaver's design and fulfill His commission in our lives. Just pray silently. How beautiful the sight of Thee must be. Thy endless wisdom, boundless love, and awesome purity. Prostrate before Thy throne to lie and gaze on Thee. Dear Jesus, forgive us if we repeat Your sacred name 1,000 times a day. Lord, You are the one who gives a vision, and You are the one who gives the empowerment to follow that vision. I pray for this team of RZIM, its apologists, its staff, its supporters, its facilitators, and those who invite us. And for the many ministries across the globe, I think of this great institution here at Wheaton, so faithful to You over many, many decades. So many names enter our mind who have served You, whose time is coming to move on, and who will pass the baton. I pray that out of this audience, You will raise up men and women who will be shining lights in a dark world. How much we need You, Father, in a world just skidding out of control, almost.
We intended to reflect that splendor, that glory. You know, if there were a moment in the New Testament that I were probably a moment or two, if I were asked to be able to listen to one sermon, I probably would want to listen to Jesus on the Emmaus Road, explaining all of history. But if I wanted to experience one moment with the disciples, that moment was given to them and they were told not to disclose it until after He was gone. That moment is at the Mount of Transfiguration, where the two people, Moses and Elijah, for whom God was the undertaker, who died extraordinary, mysterious deaths, descend on the mountain. And Jesus' body is transfigured into that glorious, brilliant whiteness. And the voice comes from the heaven, you know, "This is my Son whom I love. Listen to Him." And Peter, responding as he always did, impulsively, but here predictably, "Let's stay right here. Let's not leave." When he saw the reflective splendor in a manner that had not been vouchsafed to any other human eye until those three were given that at the mountain,
I say to you, there are many people in this world who will never know Christ and who he is until they see that reflective splendor in somebody who lives it out. That, what Gypsy Smith said, there are 5 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the Christian, and he said some people will never read the first 4. You just have to come to that point of recognizing that life lived out comes from intrinsic worth and reflective splendor. That is from creation. We move from creation to incarnation. How it was that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. And we see in the incarnation so beautifully described, actually by the Apostle Paul in Philippians chapter 2, where he says so clearly, who being in the form of God thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation and took upon himself the form of a servant. Being found in fashion as a man, he humbles himself and becomes obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Wherefore God also has exalted him and given to him a name that is above every name, that in the name of Jesus every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Watching that life has prompted even the staunchest skeptics, the likes of a W.E.H. Lecky, who so pointedly in his book on the history of morals said that no life had been so powerfully lived as this one. And in its 3 short years of active ministry, said, taught us more about ethics than all the disquisitions of philosophers and scientists. F.F. Bruce, reacting to Lecky's comment, said, there is at least one non-Christian affirmation of a life that is eternally with us. The example of Christ, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, made himself of no reputation. That divine descent, as it were, from all the power and glory down to the ultimate humiliation of the cross. And reveals to you and me what the incarnation actually signifies. It signifies to me at least 2 things amongst many others. Number 1, it signifies for me the absoluteness of the moral law. That the moral law is absolute and is born right out of the very nature of God. It is not merely propositional, but in its incarnational revelation, it shows to us that there is no self-destructiveness in God. There is no contradiction within God. There is nothing that which is mutually exclusive. God is that entity totally sustained from whom we glean and gain our moral imperatives. The 10 Commandments, fascinatingly, till this very day, hang in the courtroom at Nuremberg. They hung behind the judge when these judges themselves, who consigned millions to a ghastly death, every time they would look at the judge, they would see the 10 Commandments above. Fascinating. Go and see that till this very day. And so philosophers struggle with this. They wrestle with this. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand here. Nobody is implying that an atheist is necessarily an immoral person. Absolutely not. But one just wonders where they get their rationally compelling reason for morality. Think about that. Listen to the best-known Canadian atheist. We have not been able to show that reason requires the moral point of view, or that really rational persons, unhoodwinked by myth or ideology, need not be individual egoists or classical amoralists. Reason doesn't really decide here. The picture I have painted for you is not a pleasant one for me, and reflection on this actually depresses me. Pure, practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality. This is Guy Nielsen. Bertrand Russell, he says this. He says, I cannot live as though ethical values were simply a matter of my personal taste, and therefore I find my own views quite incredible. I do not know what the solution is, said he. J.L. Mackie, he said, the very nature of moral reasoning is such a strange concoction that it is unable to ultimately arrive at it without positing a divine or transcendent order in the first place. This is the hatpin to the heart of atheistic thinking today, or of non-theistic thinking today. It is interesting that the non-theistic religions like Buddhism and Jainism and so on, take Buddhism for example, which is an ethical religion with the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. How can one question Gautama Buddha's own journey that way? He renounced everything, he went, and after this meditative process came about with the whole ethical system that he had. If you read the history of what happened after Gautama Buddha died, and all that took place in the quarrels and the backbiting and the attempted assassinations and so on. And yet it is primarily an ethical system. Same with Islam. The first 3 or the 5 caliphs after Muhammad were assassinated. You go to the strongly Buddhist countries today, I won't name some of them. If you walk through the streets of some of those countries and see what has happened to its young people, what is done to its young people, some of those beautiful young men and women, and what's happened to them. You see, ethical theories themselves do not provide enough of an imperative to go and do and be good if you have no accountability at the end of it all before a moral authority or a moral power. And that's exactly where Hobart Maurer, the president of the American Psychological Association, who was a naturalist himself, says, you know, for several decades we psychologists have looked upon the whole matter of sin and moral accountability as a great incubus, and we've acclaimed our liberation from sin as epoch-making. But at length we've discovered to be free in this sense, that is to have the excuse of being sick rather than being sinful, is to court the danger of also becoming lost. This danger is, I believe, betokened by the widespread interest in existentialism which we are presently witnessing. In becoming amoral, ethically neutral, and free, we have cut the very roots of our being, lost our deeper sense of selfhood and identity, and with neurotics themselves find ourselves asking, who am I? What is my deepest destiny? What does living really mean? And then he quotes the Anna Russell psychiatric folk song. At 3 I had a feeling of ambivalence towards my brothers, and so it follows naturally I poisoned all my lovers. But now I'm happy I have learned the lesson this has taught, that everything I do that's wrong is someone else's fault. Many people are not aware that when I first moved to the West, I was moving into a business career. And I've told my story in walking from east to west. I always loved the food industry. I still do. It's nice to be on the served side of it rather than the serving side of it as you travel now, I must say. But I remember heading up at the banqueting department of a 5-star hotel in Toronto when I first came. I was just about 20 years old, getting ready to move to Cornell and do my degree there. And the general manager had certain habits and fancies. I won't go into it. And one night, the chef and he and I were having dinner. He was trying to goad me into a certain action that night. I said, no thanks. And then he looked at me and said, well, when are you going to become a man? When are you going to become a man? So he's my boss. So I put my knife and fork down, was eating. I said, Mr. Stanway, why do you leave the keys with me every night? To lock up everything, to put the money in the safe, and everything that you see out here that's of value, to lock away and take an inventory and put it down. Why do you do that with me? He said, I trust you. He said, if you are able tonight to talk me out of my convictions, will you still trust me? He looked at the chef and said, Tony, I'll never ask him to do it again. When I finally resigned and was leaving and moving into theological training, he came to my office and he was walking me to the door. He put his arm around me. He said, you know what? He said, we're going to miss you around here. We're going to miss you. He said, but Ravi, it was a logical step for a man like you. What he meant was, that was my passion, that was my conviction. I was heading into theological studies, and he could see all the way where this was taking me. Because he saw in that moral reasoning side of it, that you're not dealing with opinions, you're dealing with convictions. So in the incarnation, I see in Christ the absoluteness of the moral law. And the second thing I see is the supremacy of love. The supremacy of love. So in creation, you see the whole area of intrinsic worth and reflective splendor. In incarnation, you see the absoluteness of the moral law and the supremacy of love. And I could move these in any direction I want, but let me just say this. You've read C.S. Lewis's Four Loves. Many of you have, I'm sure. You've got agape, you've got storge, you've got phileo, you've got eros. Agape, the vertical love towards God and God's love for us. Storge, the protective love demonstrated by parents and protective care. Phileo, friendship or brotherly love. And eros, romantic love. So you've got those four loves. And I dare suggest to you that storge, phileo, and eros cannot truly be defined until you first understand agape. Those three hang on the peg of that vertical relationship with God. So you've got the absoluteness of the moral law, and you've got the supremacy of love. Third is transformation. You've got creation, incarnation, and third is transformation. That the ultimate change in life that needs to come is the change of all things needed. Most is to change the inclinations of my own heart and the habits of that to which I yield. You see, I've long ago come to the conclusion that my earthly loves alone will not keep me from evil. My earthly loves alone will not keep me from evil. No matter how dearly I love those to whom I am committed, there has to be something transcending, something greater, something of a transformation of the human heart that takes place within. We minimize the ultimate miracle of redemption and the transformation of the human heart, where God plants new hungers within you, new desires within you, new longings within you, new passions within you. That is really the ultimate change that comes within a human heart. I'm looking at this name because I can never quite get it straight. But years ago, 7, 8 years ago, I was in Sydney. And I remember walking up to go and get myself some lunch, and I saw this rather tough guy walking by, and he came running after me. He said, "Ravi, Ravi," he kept calling me. So I turned around, and I knew he was probably one of the delegates at the conference. And when he put his arm around me, I knew I'd never want to mess with the guy. He was tough. I said, "What's your name?" And he said, "My name, you really want to know?" I said, "Yes." He said, "My name is James Connolly Patrick Pierce Fitzsimmons. But call me James." James Connolly Patrick Pierce Fitzsimmons. I said, "Boy, your father sure gave you a name." He said, "Do you know anything about those names?" I said, "Absolutely not." He said, "I used to belong to the IRA. I fought and killed. All of those names, one after another, belong to a great IRA personality, the Irish Republican Army personality, involved in violence." He said, "My father raised me up and said, your goal in life should be to kill every one of those blank blanks on the other side." I said, "Join me for lunch." We sat down, and he told me a story of his conversion. He said, "You know what's the hardest thing?" My father looked me in the eye and said, "You've become one of those blank blanks yourself." He said, "Father, once upon a time, anybody who spoke to me, only one would be left standing at the end. You don't understand the change that has come in my life. I see this again and again and again and again. The transformation of the human heart. It prompted Mahatma Gandhi to make a comment. And actually, Bertrand Russell ultimately said it in these words. If you go to Gandhi's home in Ahmedabad, outside his home there's a banner. Of all things, it's a quote by Bertrand Russell, who says this: "It is doubtful that the Mahatma would have succeeded except that he was appealing to the conscience of a Christianized people." Think of that. It is doubtful he would have succeeded except he was appealing to the conscience of a Christianized people. Here was an atheist commenting on the success of a pantheist because of the goodness of a theist. He appealed to a conscience of a Christianized people. and the transformed human heart. I have told you this before, but if you've never read Matthew Paris's statement, Matthew Paris, an avowed atheist, but he wrote an article years ago in the Times. I carry it, a complete article on my BlackBerry with me, reading it again and again. He went to Malawi in Africa, and he saw all that was happening there, and he saw what the Christian NGOs were doing. And he comes back and he says, I find myself torn as an atheist saying what I'm about to say. He said, the only thing that'll change Africa is the gospel. He says, otherwise you'll get the wicked combination of the machete and Nike and the cell phone. He was half right. It's not just Africa. It's every nation of the world. The only thing that can ultimately transform us is the gospel that changes the hunger of the heart, that changes what we ultimately desire. So we move from creation to incarnation to transformation to consummation. Consummation, where the hope that's given to you and to me is the marvelous reality that God has created us for a purpose, and the purpose is to ultimately live in the very presence of God. So we live having unity in diversity now and diversity in community then. Unity in diversity now and diversity in community then. To me, the difference this makes is enormous. If I take the definitions of the Christian worldview, it reminds me of the freedom to change, of the freedom to live peaceably, and of the freedom to give hope. I want to give to you two quick illustrations, and then I'll close. There is a professor of geology at Islamic University of Malaysia. I want to make sure I've got his name right. I'm pretty sure I know his last name is Lee, but I believe he is I think his name is Living Lee. Yep, Professor Living Lee. Professor of Geology, Islamic University of Malaysia. I was asked to deliver a talk before their faculty and so on. It was a tough session, very tough session. Place was packed. Many of the mullahs and all were sitting right in the front row in their garbs and so on. I was to present a defense of Christianity and then answer their questions. At the end of that talk, I was just worn out with exhaustion. And the professor, Baharuddin, the head of the Department of Religion, a woman, came down, took me back to her office, and in as many words said, if it weren't prohibited, she would want to lean over and give me a kiss on my face for what just happened there in the acceptance of the message. She said, thank you for the way you presented it, because she was on edge about what might fall out on this. But Professor Living Lee was standing outside, and he said, would you go out for dinner with me tonight? I said, yeah, I'm leaving tomorrow, I'm free. So he took me out for dinner, and here's what he told me. He said, thank you for the courtesy with which you addressed the questions tonight and the way you presented it. He said, Ravi, you're the first Christian speaker they've had here at this Islamic university. This is one of the oldest Islamic universities in the world. He said, let me tell you what happened here a few years ago when Ahmed Deedat, the Muslim apologist, came. Many of you have read his name and seen his debates with people. He's a nasty guy, really nasty. He wrote to me once and asked me if I would debate him. I said, absolutely not. I said, anytime you invite somebody to debate you and tell them they'll be standing behind bulletproof glass, that alone tells me your audience. He came to the university there and he literally blasted Christianity. Called it an effeminate religion and all kinds of things. So Living Lee, as a Christian, stood up at the end of it and he said, why do you make fun of my faith and my belief in Jesus Christ? He said, because your faith is foolish and nonsensical. He said, why do you say that? He said, come on up here. Come on up here. So he called Living Lee up to the front. And Living Lee is standing there, professor of geology at this prestigious university, far more educated than Deedat was, obviously. And Deedat looked at him and he said, look me in the eye now. And he looked at him and he took his hand and just gave him one ringer of a slap across the face. Living Lee said, my whole face was burning with the slap, he said. He said, turn the other cheek now. He said, come on, this is your faith, turn the other cheek. And so livingly, he said, my lips were quivering, the tears running down my face. I don't know how I'm going to withstand another. He said, I turned my cheek. Then Dida just looked at him as he could hear some muttering in the audience, almost telling him, don't make a fool of yourself. So he said, look, I've got a better solution. Give me your shirt. So Living Lee takes off his shirt, gives it to him. So now he's in his undershirt and trousers. He said, you're supposed to give me your trousers too. So Living Lee looks around the student body and all. He said, my dear students, please forgive me for doing this. He unbelted his pant, took out his trousers, and gave it to Dida. And somebody, I think from the audience, said enough or something like that. Stopped. And Dida was left there holding his trousers and shirt, and the professor in his underwear, who turns around and walks back to his office. He said, Brother Ravi, I closed the door and I sobbed. I cried. I was hurting so much. But I knew something had happened last night that would never have won my students any other way. He said for hours they were lined up outside my office, all Muslim students coming in, begging for forgiveness for what was just done to him. See, the supremacy of love in the face of a mild form of lunacy. John Polkinghorne, the quantum physicist, said this, and I close. Reality is a multi-layered unity. I can perceive another person as an aggregation of atoms, an open biochemical system in interaction with the environment, a specimen of Homo sapiens, an object of beauty, someone who needs and deserves my respect and compassion, and yes, as a brother for whom Jesus Christ died. Were all that true and all that mysteriously called here in that one person, to deny any one of these levels is to diminish both that person and myself, the perceiver. To do less than justice to the richness of reality, part of the case for theism, that in God the Creator, the source of all being, these different levels find their lodging and their guarantee. He is the source of all connections. The one who's created that holds in one the worldview of science, aesthetics, ethics, and religion as expressions of his reason, joy, will, and presence. This interlocking character of the Lord of creation finds its finest expression, says Polkinghorne, in the concept of the sacrament, an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace, a wonderful fusion of concerns of science and theology. Thus in the Eucharist, bread and wine, which in the words of the liturgy, earth has given and human hands have made, then symbolize the body and blood of Christ, the source of spiritual life. The greatest sacrament compared to which all of us are types and shadows is the incarnation, in which the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. And we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only Son from the Father. And he goes on to talk about the Logos. This blending of matter, spirit, ideas, expressions, reality that bring together the best of earth and the best of heaven to reveal in the splendor of that simple thing we call the Eucharist, the thanks. This is my broken body. This is my blood which is shed for you. The communion that we have with the living God to remind us that we are not our own, that we are reflections of his beauty in a world that is so starved of definitions and of understanding what it means to be human. This, to me, is my response to the question of what it really means to be human. From creation, incarnation, transformation, and consummation, it is the only coherent worldview that I know that answers the basic questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny.
You've been watching Let My People Think with Dr. Ravi Zacharias. We're grateful for your prayer.